Hello, and welcome to Part 3 of the law lecture entitled Antimicrobial Resistance. In this lecture, we will discuss the problem with antimicrobial resistance, discuss the GAIN Act, define an LPAD, discuss the LPAD mechanism, and discuss the STAR Act. The CDC estimates that annually, at least 2 million illnesses and 23,000 deaths are caused by antibiotic resistance. The CDC currently tracks 18 hospital-based pathogens that are known to have antimicrobial resistance. Of those pathogens, the ones with the most concern are the enteric bacteria, mainly the carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. This bacteria is resistant to all antibiotics on the market. In 2001, CRE was found in only one state in the U.S. However, it is currently found in 44 states. We must fight back against this antimicrobial resistance by preventing infection and the spread of disease. We can do this by ensuring that we receive all CDC-approved vaccinations. The CDC has put into effect whole genome sequencing of the pathogens they are tracking in order to identify them as well as their trends of developing resistance. We also need to improve prescribing and use of antibiotics through antimicrobial stewardship. The Infectious Disease Societies of America recommend that on every prescription for antibiotic there should be a time frame on when to stop the antibiotic, an indication for which the antibiotic is used, and a follow-up in 48 hours with the prescriber. The final thing is developing new drugs as a reason of fighting back. However, at least 10 years before any new class of drugs will be available. So stewardship is vital to the current situation that we are in. There are many challenges to antibiotic research and development, the first being economic. Antibiotics are used for short durations, and sometimes are held in reserve as last possible resorts for patients. Pricing is another big issue as a challenge for research and development, because the drug company wants to make sure they can get that money back that they put into the drug. Lifestyle and chronic disease drugs are more profitable, mainly because antibiotics, as I said before, are cheap and in short durations. However, chronic disease drugs are used over a long period of time, and the drug company can get money back from their drug. The second challenge is scientific. In 1990, there were 20 pharmaceutical companies that were developing antibiotics. In 2013, that number is currently down to 2 companies. Regulatory is also a very big challenge, because identifying patients for traditional clinical trials, where a large number of patients are needed, is very difficult with antimicrobial resistance, and those drugs needed to treat those antimicrobial resistant organisms. Also, the FDA guidance for industry is infeasible. One way the government is trying to avert the antimicrobial resistance problem is through the GAIN Act, Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now. This was passed in 2012, and it created incentives to encourage the development of products to treat, prevent, detect, and diagnose antibiotic-resistant infections. It provides an extra 5 years of exclusivity to certain new antibiotics, namely those that treat gram-positive resistant bacteria, such as MRSA, VRE, and VRSA, multi-drug resistant gram-negative bacteria, such as E. coli, Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, and Klebsiella, and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. It was determined that after the GAIN Act was passed, more incentives were needed to spur antimicrobial development. A new term in the marketplace is LPAD, which is Limited Population Antibacterial Drug. These drugs are antibiotics that treat serious or deadly infections in patients with no viable treatment options. They're narrowly indicated for use in a small, well-defined population of patients for whom the benefit of the drug outweighs the risks. To counteract the growing antibacterial resistance problem, an LPAD approval mechanism has been proposed. The goal of this mechanism is to expedite the approval process for antibacterial drugs that could potentially treat serious or deadly infections in patients with no viable treatment options. Without this mechanism, the healthcare of patients who will face these resistant infections in the future will inevitably be neglected. Specifically, the law should create a special designation and label distinguishing products approved under the limited approval pathway from traditional antibiotics, those drugs that are approved for more common infections or for infections with satisfactory therapeutic options do exist. It should acknowledge that the benefits of an antibiotic approved under the pathway outweigh the risks for the limited population for which the drug are indicated, based on smaller data sets, taking into account the seriousness of the infection and the unmet medical need. It should include a mechanism to collect information in order to evaluate the utility of the pathway, preferably including the FDA and/or the CDC. It should require the FDA guidance within 1 year of enactment on acceptable clinical trial designs to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of antibiotics approved under this pathway. It should ensure that the option to pursue this pathway for limited approval is voluntary for the drug companies. And finally, allow removal of the limited population designation if the FDA approves a broader indication sought by the drug company under the traditional approval pathway. The special limited population pathway could have a number of important effects. First, the streamlined process would provide patients more rapid access to potentially life-saving therapies by lowering regulatory barriers to the development of antibiotics they need most, providing an incentive for companies that otherwise would be discouraged by prohibitively high development costs and the lengthy testing timelines. Second, narrow indications could create conditions for value-based or premium pricing for high-need antibiotics, which will encourage greater research and development investment. Third, Congress's support for this new drug pathway and the FDA special designation and labeling will send a strong signal to the healthcare community and patients about the critical need to use these drugs prudently, given that their approval will be based on a benefit-risk assessment that supports the use in limited high-risk populations, but not in the broad population of patients suffering with infections that can be treated effectively with existing drugs. The designation and labeling will also help encourage judicious use of limited population antibiotics, which is an important goal if we are to preserve the effectiveness of these vital medications over time. Finally, many companies have abandoned antibiotic development during the past decade, citing regulatory challenges as the primary reason. By making the approval pathway for high-need medications more feasible, the limited population pathway may encourage drug developers to invest once again in this field. A 2012 study conducted at Columbia University found that each antibiotic-resistant infection costs on average over $15,000 more to treat than susceptible infections. The CDC reports that estimates of the total economic cost of antibiotic resistance to the U.S. economy have ranged as high as $20 billion in excess direct healthcare costs, with additional costs to society for loss of productivity as high as $35 billion a year. The strategies to address antimicrobial resistance, or STAR Act, would strengthen the federal response to antimicrobial resistance by promoting prevention, which intensifies and expands academic public health partnerships through the CDC's current prevention epicenters to support evaluation of interventions to prevent or limit resistance. Tracking resistant bacteria, which would improve data collection for human antimicrobial drug consumption and resistance, as well as direct the CDC to report every 2 years on resistance trends, threats, and antibiotic use. It would improve the use of antibiotics by authorizing grants to healthcare facilities to study the development and implementation of antimicrobial stewardship programs and direct the piloting and testing of antibiotic appropriate use quality measures. It would enhance leadership, coordination, and accountability by reauthorizing the Antimicrobial Resistance Task Force and establishing benchmarks to monitor progress of implementing task force recommendations. It would also identify a director within the Department of Health and Human Services to oversee the task force and coordinate efforts in combating antimicrobial resistance. Finally, it would support research by directing the National Institutes of Health to work with other agencies and experts to create a strategic research plan for antimicrobial resistance to provide a detailed path forward for future funding of epidemiological, interventional, clinical, behavioral, translational, and basic research efforts. There are a large number of supporters and different organizations for the STAR Act, including the Infectious Disease Societies of America and the Society of Infectious Disease Pharmacists. Representative Matheson and Senator Brown are planning to introduce this bill within the next year, and we'll see where that takes us after it gets introduced. This concludes our lecture on antimicrobial resistance. So what you need to do next is on Moodle, post the answer to this question. What barriers do you see to the implementation of the LPAD mechanism?